Welcome to Homeschool Your Way. I'm your host, Janna Cook, and Bookshark's community manager. Today's episode, I'm going to be focusing on some tips for strength-based homeschooling. My guest is Sam Young. He is the director of Young Scholars Academy, and he has a plethora of information to share with us today. So let's jump in. Sam, thanks so much for being here.
Janna, thanks for having me. I'm thrilled to be back on the podcast.
Well, I love that you're back, and I love that you have a niche of maybe a term that not a lot of new homeschool parents or parents in general have heard. So let's jump right in and talk about 2E students.
Yeah, so this is a population that I think gives a lot of people some grace once they understand it. And a lot of the times people hear this and they think, oh, I know someone like that. Maybe I have someone like that, or maybe I am someone like that. But the idea behind the idea behind twice exceptionality is that essentially we have these dual exceptional existences, right? We could have someone who has an exceptional strength area, which could be like 2 standard deviations over on that bell curve that we think of a lot of the time. So it could be someone who has like a high IQ or is an exceptional athlete or leader. And it doesn't always have to be like schoolhouse gifted. And then at the same time, they have an exceptional struggle area, which could be a learning difference like ADHD or autism that brings about other challenges. So it's the dual existence of these two differences, a strength and a struggle that we call the twice exceptionalities, or the 2E as it's often shortened to.
I think many homeschool parents like myself would be surprised that A, we didn't know this was a thing, but B, we are familiar with it either in our own homes with ourselves or someone that we are closely in relationship with. It kind of is a light bulb like, oh, okay. So, yes, they're really good at that. And then you just expect them to be really good at everything else. And then you see these deficits and you're thinking, is it rebellion? Is it laziness? Is it non-compliance? And a lot of times when we're speaking specifically to this area, it's none of those things.
Right. And I think that as a society, we often want to put things in boxes, right? Like we think of like gifted or learning difference, right? That someone is either one or the other. And there's a reason that happens. First of all, again, we largely like to think of like this or that, right? Cats or dogs, Pepsi or Coke, right? We don't think of the and. But more complexly, when we look psychologically, there's a concept called masking, which actually helps us better understand that, which is the principle that we can actually have one of these pronounced exceptionalities cover the other. So you can have the gift cover the learning difference struggle area. You can have the struggle cover the gift or exceptional ability area. And we can actually have a dual masking where they cover one another. And it can be really difficult to detect. And one of my favorite psychologist, Dr. Joseph Renzulli, says that, that gifted behaviors, and he says behaviors, not giftedness, appear at certain times in certain people under certain circumstances. And it's kind of these 3 ideas of, the time, the person, and the space that allow us to shine or to struggle, context dependent, so to speak.
Well, and I would say personally, I tend to lean towards activities and challenges that I know I'm going to be able to accomplish or do well at so that I don't have to look at those deficits in my own life and go, well, I know I'm not good at this. So instead of struggling in that and accomplishing what I can accomplish, I will gravitate toward the things I know I can accomplish well. So it always looks like I'm accomplishing well. Well, it's because I'm not doing the things I don't that I struggle with, right, in public. And how many times, if we're doing that as adults who have fully formed brains and have great coping mechanisms, how much more are our children doing that? And it just looks like, like I said, to me as a parent, it comes off a lot as non-compliance. And so my first response is discipline. I need to discipline. And that is actually has made it a lot worse in some cases when I'm trying to do that with my children, as opposed to understanding, okay, this is something that is being masked, or this is something that you're overcompensating in. And so it's like being a parent, and especially a homeschool parent, I've just learned more and more about my deficits and the things that I don't know. But I think one of the biggest strengths for parents in this situation is to learn So the more you know, the better you can behave even in your own parenting and then in your homeschool. So I think that brings us to this. You have some great tips for our listeners about strength-based homeschooling and learning. And again, that might be something that parents aren't super familiar with. So let's start with a definition of that.
Yeah. So when we think of strength-based, it's exactly what you just said with your own personal example, right? A lot of education is often deficit-based, which is this idea that like we're helping students kind of bring the bottom up. You're not doing this. This is your lowest grade. This is your weak point. And it's counterintuitive. As you said, as adults, we have the autonomy, the freedom to move toward the things that we're good at and the things that we love. And that's where we find humans we're pleasure seekers, right? We pursue dopamine. So when we do something that feels good, it looks good, people compliment us, it meets our needs. There's the neuro element, there's the social element. I mean, we're firing on all cylinders. And a lot of times education is taking our students outside of that, right? It's taking a creative, quirky, outside the box artist and having them do like a spreadsheet, right, ad nauseum. It's just like it's their hell. It's not where they're thriving. And the goal is, I think, for us as adults, parents, mentors, educators, to model that, and then also to develop our students' strengths and abilities and talents. And so a strength-based perspective is just helping our students focus and develop on the things that they're interested in, they're good at, they feel good about, and having them do more of that rather than trying to kind of bring the bottom up or pushing the top up.
So let me play devil's advocate for just a moment. As a parent, and I said, Sam, that sounds great. And my daughter could read 20 hours a day and be completely satisfied. Yet I need her to understand basic math so that when she starts adulting, she is able to be a producing member of society. How would that look if I'm focusing on her strengths to try to get her to do the things that she has deficits in? Because I know you're not saying just let your kids do whatever they're good at and ignore the other things that need strengthening.
Yeah, this is one that comes up, as you might imagine, a lot, right? And I like to challenge it with just who are we as a society, right? Like, do you care about Michael Phelps' ability to do a spreadsheet? Are you thinking about Ariana Grande's ability to do complex mathematics? When we think of Albert Einstein, are we concerned with his ability to paint? No. So I think as a society, we accept people who are exceptionally good at one thing with a micro focus. I don't care about how Steve Jobs is as a writer, but he invented a pretty darn cool computer, right? And so I think we can kind of check ourselves. But yeah, sure. Are there kind of non-negotiable? Should people be able to at least do basic arithmetic or utilize devices that do? Of course they should. Can we make it more authentic and more fun? If you want me to do a statistics and learn, the importance of stats because you believe that it's going to change the way that I perceive and see numbers, cool. Maybe you can have me analyze like how many people get hurt cliff jumping every year rather than, doing something that's kind of a snooze fest. Or you bake it around my interest and my strength. Okay. I'm a reader like your daughter. I love to read. Maybe I want to be an author one day. Okay, well, can we kind of math this? How many pages do I have to write each week to get a book by a certain date? And what would be a good price point? So we can do it around the interest. We can separate it from the interest if we want and just make it more authentic and more fun. But my whole point is let's try to let go as much about what our kids are not doing and focus more on what they are doing, because that's how they're going to feel good. And that's how they're going to offer authentic value, in this world.
And it definitely sounds like a holistic approach when you're talking about children and students. It's like, I'm not just looking at what they can produce because third grade says they should know their multiplication facts. It's my child on a whole has these talents and is really good at that. And while maybe they, according to the system, and we say nobody knows who they are, but the ethereal they, and it's pressure from our neighbors, from our family members, especially as homeschool parents, like, well, do they know this? Do they know this? And then I often want to stop and say, and start rattling stuff off that, well, do you know this? Do you know this? Like, why does it matter if my kid knows that or not, especially in the day and age when Google is at everyone's fingertips if you need information. And so looking at your child and focusing on what they're good at, we need to give permission to parents and say, this is okay. This is not a bad or detrimental philosophy. So kind of help me unpack why it isn't. What are those tips that can kind of show parents why this really does work?
Yeah, I think there's sort of three domains that I usually explore, which is so typically when we talk about supporting homeschoolers and developing the strength-based approach, there's really these three main buckets, I like to say, or these three areas. There's the mindset, which we've largely already talked about, which is this strength-based positive psychology approach. There's the productivity and production area, which we're going to get into. And then there's the what I call the proverbial village, which is the fact that, a lot of homeschoolers are really largely kind of isolated and can be really benefit a tremendous amount from being a part of something that is bigger than themselves, which I call the village. So again, we've talked about the positive psychology and the strength-based part, but I'd like to move ahead to the idea of how we can help our students to the last comment here on the mindset is how we can let go a bit, right? And I think that that's kind of been the subtext of what we've been talking about. How can we let our students have a bit more space to explore something rather than do what we think they quote unquote should or ought to do, right? And again, I know that's I'm going to upset some people, but we don't know how to see into the future and predict what our kids are going to do, right? And I hark back a lot to, at some point, I'm sure that Jim Carrey was doing impressions in the back of a classroom, and some teacher was like, "Stop messing around and read," and it's like, well, what got him further? So we don't always know the things that we don't have the crystal ball to say like what's going to allow our students to really show up in this world. And I think that just giving them space to like lean into their own experience and pursue things that excite them. I like the idea of like the hero's journey. So one of my kind of like my number 3 tip is, think of who you are in the hero's journey. You're the mentor, not the hero, right? We're Yoda, not Luke Skywalker. So it's important for us to remember that our job is just to help them go on their journey and encourage them to cross the threshold when they struggle. Right. And we have to let go a bit of how they go, when they go, where they go. And that can be really scary. And that's especially true when we're talking about like, picking certain things that they're going to study or not doing that, which can be really scary too.
I
So
think parents have a real unfortunate fatalistic view. I'll speak personally. As a parent, I sometimes get a very fatalistic view of the choices that my children are making. I do somehow perceive that I have a crystal ball because of my experiences, and if they choose this, well, that's it. You're in a ditch, or you're down in a van by the river, right? Like you're a non-producing member of society, and maybe as homeschool parents, we have this extra external pressure that we're putting on ourselves to prove that we are doing the right thing for our kids. So I think we do some of us do have this drive, not only to prove that our children are doing well, but that we made the right choice. And so I like this idea of, you're talking about mindset, like we're really talking about us as parents, as educators. It's like so many times I think I'm going to get on here and someone's going to give me this tip that's going to change my child. And it always ends up being about changing me. And Sam, I'm going to be honest, it gets really frustrating sometimes.
yeah, it's exactly that, Janna. And I start with these tips are in order, because the work starts with you, and the work starts with us, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so that's the big idea. Sir Ken Robinson said this in this famous TED talk, like our school's killing creativity. He said, everyone's had an education and therefore we all have an opinion, right? We all have this idea of how things ought to be because of the way in which it was done. And this is a homeschooling audience, right? But we still have this idea, even though, unless you as a parent were homeschooled, we have this idea that there's certain things that are kind of non-negotiables, right? And again, I'm not calling for like a total radical overhaul of homeschooling or any kind of schooling. I'm simply saying, can we let go a little bit and realize that whatever we're doing might be out of date, out of touch, or not relevant with who our kiddo is. And that's a hard pill to swallow. And that's why we start there, because it does start with us. And then we can help our kids.
So if we've gotten past this, if we've gotten past ourselves, which sounds like the biggest roadblock a lot of the times in this journey, and now we're open to see, okay, I'm willing to look at a different way. I'm willing to put aside maybe some social parameters that are outdated, antiquated, or maybe my own ideals. Now what?
Yeah, that's it. So the next one that really comes up for us is understanding learning, right? Understanding the way in which we do the things that we do. A lot of the times we can get frustrated, as you said, we can come down on our kids and say, you're not doing this or you're not doing that. And it feels like an affront. And when we understand the way in which, what are we often asking to do, right? There's really kind of three things: intake information, process the information, and then do something with it. And so when we break learning down and we say, okay, well, it's not just that like they're not reading, so they're not learning. It's just that they're not doing the intake well. And the question comes up is, I say, my kind of next tip is that we have to become like a differentiation yogi. Can we discover the really four elements of differentiation, which would be the content, the process, the product, and the environment. So what they're learning, the way in which they're learning, so YouTube, podcasts, etc., the medium, the product, what are we asking them to do? Is it just fill out a worksheet, or is it something that's really meaningful to them, like recording their own podcast, for example? And then what's the environment in which they're doing it? I cannot work at a cafe, no matter how excited I am about what I'm doing, because I have ADHD. I need to face a white wall and just be alone. So, we have to really look at all four of those. Again, it's content, process, product, and environment. And we might realize that, well, the strengths and the interests are there. It might be the way in which one of those four is breaking down, right? And that then goes to an either bigger point, and stop me if you want to get in here. I just going, and I need to be reined in sometimes. But the fourth big point that I make is it authentic, right? And that dovetails really nicely. Like, is it something that they genuinely care about? You could say that's the same as a strength based and so forth, but is it real? Are they doing something that's meaningful? When you homeschool, you have the opportunity to say yes to that question. We don't need to just do worksheets. We can have real conversations, affect real change, design real websites, talk to real government officials. We can do big things. And so I know that can sometimes take more work, but you'll find that when your student's doing something that's authentic, even if it's just sharing authentic ideas with like-minded people, it's going to feel more important, right? If you say, Sam, have you done XYZ? I'll say, yeah. If you say, great, can you show me on your website right now? Whoa, I wasn't ready for that, right? There's an extra level of work. So if you kind of prime me from the get-go, and I know that I'm going to be doing something that's going to be on a real website, someone's really going to see it, that's huge. I'm going to rise to the occasion, and I'm probably going to learn a lot along the way.
And
I
it's
might
going
need
to be
support.
a type of learning that is really, I hate to use the word authentic again, because you use that word already, but it really is a type of learning that sticks, right? I mean, I could survey 100 45-year-olds and say, do you recall the shot that was heard around the world? And they're like, you know what I mean? Like, I think about, they used to do this segment on Jay Leno, which is really dating myself, but it would be called jaywalking. And he would
Yeah, I
ask
love that.
people certain questions, and they would just, they'd be like, I would always be amazed. I'm like, they don't know what that is. But typically I can connect a novel that I read, a historical novel, or a piece that I was connected to emotionally. And of course I'm going to remember that. And I can see the scene in my mind and the parade and what was happening. But it's real to me, but not to my husband. If you asked him that question, he'd be like, why do I care? And why are you asking me this question? Right. So sometimes I look at my kids and I'm almost asking the wrong question. I'm asking a question from where I'm emotionally connected to it, instead of something that they're excited about or emotionally connected to. So while I think about like Bookshark, how we have a prescribed curriculum, and a lot of parents will be like, oh, my kid didn't like that book. And then you have the traditionalists who are like, power through, it's got a great ending, there's a reason we have that book in the curriculum. And I don't disagree with that, but I'm also like, you could throw it out, replace it with the book that maybe they're interested in, and then loop it back in somehow, right? Like,
Mhm.
we can be creative. And I have to remind myself as a homeschool parent, like, I'm doing this so I can be creative. And yet I'm probably one of the least creative homeschool parents I know. And I keep reminding myself, like, well, you don't have to do it the way everyone's doing it. That's the reason you're doing this. Like, but it's hard because in theory that sounds great, but in practicality we go back to what we're comfortable with, back to what we know. And so if you're telling me like instead of having my daughter write a 4-page report on World War II, I could have her do these other things that she would much rather do. It's going to actually sink in and become real to her versus drudge through this factual paper and great, I did it, but I'm gonna never think about it again because I have all these negative emotions that you made me do something that I wasn't connected to.
Mm-hmm. And again, it's the four elements of the content, the product, the process, and the environment. Like, what is something that she would care about that would feel important, or in this case, feel authentic, and have some staying power? Because if you ask me, if you ask parents, what 20, 30, 40 years after they've been at a certain grade in school, what do you remember? Was it the worksheet, or was it the novel you fell in love with that you chose, or was it the diorama that you made about the salamander, or whatever it was probably that, right? That's the thing that stays. And so the more choice and the more connection that we can foster, the more likely we are to have these kids hold on to things. And then we get to even bigger questions, which is, what are we trying to do in the first place?
Right.
And I think that leads to my number 5 tip to homeschool parents, which is, it's foster divergent thinking, right? Is a lot of the times we're doing these things that there's sort of finite answers. I go to the brick example, right? Like, we could have a student memorize the year a brick was invented, or who invented it, and that is interesting. And by the way, I'm a history teacher. I actually like that stuff a lot. But what might serve better is to understand the context in which the brick was built, right? Or understand the culture in which the brick was built. Or if we want to really go divergent, ask, how many uses can you come up with for a brick? How many problems were they trying to solve when the brick was created? How many things can you do right now with a brick, right? And I say that because if we think about the things that we're asking schools to do, and I just had this conversation yesterday with actually my former boss, the headmaster of a school that I worked at for about 10 years. We had a conversation yesterday about how the worst employees are the best students. And you take someone that's been to a really great school, maybe an Ivy League school, they've worked really hard, and they're schoolhouse gifted, and that's incredibly impressive, and I don't take that away from them. But how have they gotten there? By being probably really smart and really safe, right? Memorizing the thing, staying in the lane, doing things that are right. If you ask me, my ideal employee, when I'm hiring someone, I want someone who can think freely. I want someone who can problem solve and understand the values of a business, and then make decisions on their own, and think differently. Can we use the things that we already have and repurpose them? Can we identify gapes and gaping holes in markets and solve them, right? And so I think another thing that we need to make a shift to is not just what kind of work we're doing, and is it authentic, and what's the product and process, but is it aligned with more divergent thinking, rather than pushing to the center, pushing out to the fringes? Because we're in a new era, right? This is like the era of like AI and asking big questions, and we're probably not going to need to memorize a bunch of facts and figures anyway. So we might as well lean into the most human thing we can do, which is creative, divergent problem solving.
I mean, even that statement is very disruptive to all of the systems that you and I know so very well, right? Like, if you're saying, oh my gosh, let people thrive in the spaces that they are excited and passionate about. I mean, it sounds amazing, but also very scary, right? And as parents, we're like, oh my gosh, sure, she's going to be able to paint a beautiful mural, and maybe she'll be remembered 100 years from now, but she couldn't keep her checking account above zero to save her life, right? And then as soon as I say that, I even go, yeah, but there's apps that'll like ding you when you're getting close. And there's things that are like, hey, you can't, there's just certain ways that we now are able to compensate those very things that I think as parents we worry about that our kids aren't going to be able to do. And so what a great time to be homeschool parents and give ourselves permission to start looking at things in a different way. I love the word divergent thinking. It's so amazing that we're not worried about our daily like a food, right, and shelter. Like we've got that. At least most of us are in a place where because we're homeschooling, we have that covered, right? So now instead of just thinking about what we need to survive, let's start thinking about what we can do to help our children, like you say, thrive.
Hmm. Absolutely. Yeah. There's a real kind of ascension that comes with that. And it can be really difficult. And you're right. Like if you have a kid who's an incredible reader, but they don't look both ways before they cross the street, like we need to, keep them safe, right? And we do need to stop and bake in some of those skills or bring around an awareness or leverage some kind of technology. Um, there are very real concerns, but I think as a focus, as a headspace, I'd like to have us enter. Right? I'm not advocating that we, single task forever and never do anything else. Sure, you're right. Like you can be an incredible painter, but if you can't pay your bills, then where will you paint? Because it won't be in your home because well, it might be hard to keep it. So it's important that we do these things and these kind of adulting skills and so forth. But I also think as a headspace that we want to enter into a place where we're helping our students develop their strengths, do it authentically, do it divergently, and do it in a differentiated manner.
And I think that's a perfect example because as you were saying that, I'm like, well, I could turn math around and say, how many tubes of paint are you going to be able to buy? How much you're going to have to sell your painting for to make sure? I mean, there's ways like this is what you're talking about, strength based, right? Like, okay, I'm not going to get my child's pie head out of the sky. They just want to do this and that's fine. But now I get to be creative as the parent and find ways to loop in why it's going to be meaningful to my student. Like, that's great. But if you don't have you don't pay rent, you don't have a place to paint. So, I mean, that is just a perfect example of how this really can work full circle so that we are covering all our bases, but still focusing on what our students love.
And the beautiful thing about strengths is that everyone has them, right? And that they're different. So like, don't ever have me do anything, like finance, budget, spreadsheet related. Like you would be better off trying to write with your feet with crayons. I am not good at that, but I hire people who do that, right? And that's a privileged thing to say you can't do that right away and you have to learn the basics because you don't start out doing that. But eventually, like someone's strength is my weakness and vice versa, right? And so as a society, we help one another out. That's the point of talent, one of the points of talent development. And so I think that serves us really well as a broader society too. But I recognize there's a level of privilege that comes with that too, because we do have to be able to maintain our basic things by ourselves. Good. There's so many tips. I could keep going forever. I don't know. Am I doing okay?
Well, I think, yeah, but I think that leads into your last point of village, of why we need to be connected with people, because I am not great at everything. I know this is going to be shocking, but like, and my family would say, I don't think she's ever said that at the dinner table. There are things I'm not good at. And there's things that I don't like to do. Like I had to clean my family's bathrooms as a kid every Saturday. And you want to see a procrastinator? I procrastinated every single weekend, unless there was like, you can't go out until you do it. Boy, I'd do it so fast, it wouldn't even matter, right? But if I didn't have plans, I'm like, I could put it off for forever. I don't even care. So it's like, we have things that we're good at and our kids are good at, and there's things that we don't like to do. We can surround ourselves with people who their strengths are our weaknesses, right? And so that's why we need community. So talk a little bit about that.
Yeah. So again, and I feel like we've created a safe space here because you can say things that your kids don't know. So we've arrived at the goal of the virtual village. But the idea that I refer to when I say the village or the virtual village really is just that. It's that we are a part of something, because as parents, you know all too well that you could say something until you're blue in the face, but when someone else says it once that your child admires, they listen and it stays with them, right? And so, if we look at like ancient civilizations, we see that there's always been a communal element. There's always been a tribal element of raising children, and we can't go it alone. And when you homeschool, to some effect, you're choosing to go it alone, right? That the system is not working for whatever reason, and we'd like to go our own direction. But that's a decision that can simply just pivot you into another village, right? But it should not be, going to a place of 0 or 1. And so what I say is that we really need these village elders to come in and who have our strengths, sure, but mainly who have the things that we maybe aren't strong at that are more aligned with our children's strengths, because that's most relevant. And your job as a parent is not to be good at everything. It's to find people who are good at the things that are relevant for that period of your child's life. And I think as parents, building the village, what I call the village, your job is to curate. It's to find mentors, to surround your children by people who can show them both laterally. I say, like, look side to side and say, these kids are like me. They have similar interests and similar curiosities, and I'm okay. And then they can look up vertically at mentors and say, that person's like me, but grown up, and I'm going to be okay. And I think when they can do both, we've arrived, right? We've not, the job's not over, but but we're making strides, right? And so it's so important that, I talk about this a lot, but like, humans are social creatures who happen to think. And as parents, we often worry most about the thinking, right? The school has to be set up and the learning is structured and so forth. But if we don't handle that social element, if they're not surrounded by like-minded friends, they're not studying under, mentors who really get them and see them and can answer their burning questions and ask them even bigger questions that keep them up at night, then we're not meeting those social needs first, and then the learning can't happen anyway. So I say, curate a village, find people who get your kid, who see your kid, who can help your kid shine, can delve into all the quirky, unique, you might even think bizarre interests that your child has, and just develop them and hold them to a high level, but in a safe way that makes them intrinsically motivated to want to do better, be better, to grow, to take risks, and feel really good in that space. And I mean, that's why I founded Young Scholars Academy. It's to create a virtual village. So we have these, we have about 13 mentors. We have 13 different mentors, and we have about 180 families right now who come together each week to do just that. And I had a mom like a couple of weeks ago say that she's called it the YSA glow. After my son gets out of improv, he's on a 24-hour high, and he loves the teacher. There's like trivia about the teacher. Do you know Miss Jackson's hair isn't all purple? It's only purple in the front, and behind it, it's actually black. And so like the little things that they care about the improv teacher, they love her and they want to, they feel safe and they feel seen, and they can really shine. And she's just like them, all grown up. And then they're hanging out and friends together. And so, again, I say, don't go it alone. If you're having difficulty, if you're struggling to do certain things, find a community to belong to. You will help other parents, and other parents can help you, and your kids will come together in the way in which they're meant to, and support one another and see one another. And it's the most beautiful thing on earth when our kids are seeing and seen and can support one another, and when you can get support too, because you're not doing it alone either, and you certainly don't need to. And that's so important to hear, that just because you've left one system doesn't mean you have to go it alone.
I would say that community is one of the things that some homeschooling families find organically. And then there's other homeschooling families that really struggle to find where they belong in this environment of homeschool, because maybe they're not the traditional homeschool family. Maybe they don't have what it looks like, it just what it always has looked like. It looks very different. The landscape's very different than what it used to be when I homeschooled 40 years ago. So I love that you've created a space in Young Scholars Academy, that there are other online communities. If people can't find it in their own backyard, they certainly can then make it. And we have the access to the internet, which is amazing and scary in and all of itself, but that there are things out there that maybe they just didn't know about. So hopefully this episode, not only all the information, because it's going to take me a while to process through all of that, Sam, but also just knowing that they can reach out and find that there's other people who are there to come alongside them and support them in their journey. And I think that's what this podcast has hopefully really come across as being like. You can do it a ton of different ways, and it's going to look different for everybody, but you can find like-minded people, or at least encouragement when you turn it on. So I want to thank you once again for being here. It's always a pleasure. And we will be putting in the show notes links to Young Scholars Academy, so that you can find out more about what Sam and his staff are doing in the virtual world.
Thank you, Janna.
So
this was so fun.
Thank you. Until next time.